It's about to go down today. Last week, we learned about a number of actions that Parliament took that greatly annoyed the colonists after the French and Indian War during the 1760s. Perhaps a new decade would bring about new changes? Not quite.
In 1770, the colonists remained angry that British troops were living in their towns and cities. They thought that the soldiers were rowdy and rude, and they were also upset when soldiers took jobs away from them. The British soldiers could work for low pay in their spare time.
Clearly, the colonists weren't over the Stamp Act or the Quartering Act. And worse yet, the British soldiers are taking jobs from the colonists who, let's face it, need the money way more than the soldiers do. We've been trashing the British soldiers for a while now, perhaps for good reason, but, they're people too.
However, the soldiers weren't content either. They were far from their homes, and the colonist anger made their jobs more difficult.
I'm sure you felt this way too. I know I have. Growing up, my family went on a lot of road trips for vacations. They were great, but spending upwards of 8 hours per day in a cramped car out in the middle of nowhere far away from home, you do start to get a little cranky, especially if you have siblings. In the same way, despite their actions towards the colonists, the British soldiers weren't exactly feeling comfortable themselves either. And they say that time heals most wounds, but in this case, that's just plain wrong. That was the case during the 1770s in Boston, Massachusetts.
As time went on, the relationship between the soldiers and colonists worsened. Things were especially tense in the city of Boston. The colonists showed their hatred for the soldiers by making fun of their red coats. They called them names like lobsterback, and some soldiers went out of their way to annoy local citizens. Soon, name-calling and fistfights in the streets were common between soldiers and colonists.
We've all been there. When someone is constantly bothering you, eventually that patience wears thin and the maturity just flies out the window, and now both of you are starting to fight with each other. The last sentence in that paragraph is key here. Due to the constant back and forth fighting between the colonists and British soldiers, one of the most historic events in our nation's history went down in the streets of Boston.
On the cold night of March 5th, 1770, violence erupted in Boston. A British soldier was standing guard at the Custom House, a building where the disputed taxes were collected from the colonists. A crowd began to gather, and the people called the soldiers offensive names. Some of them even began to throw stones and snowballs. Captain Thomas Preston and the other soldiers hurried to the guards' defense. They loaded their muskets, a type of gun. Still, the crowd continued taunting the soldiers, and some of the colonists threw more snowballs and chunks of ice at them.
Obviously, the city of Boston has changed a little bit, but what hasn't changed is this building right here. On March 5th, 1770, this building right here was the backdrop of what's about to go down. The last paragraph ended with the soldiers loading their guns, and the next paragraph begins with a crowd of people hurling insults, stones, and snowballs. Both of these things aren't great. Also, side note before moving on, you might think to yourself that throwing snowballs really isn't all that bad. But let me tell you, having grown up there, that snow gets real icy and hard, and it really hurts if one of those things hits you. But let's get back to the text to see what happens.
No one is sure about what happened next. Some people said that Captain Preston told his soldiers not to fire their guns at the colonists. However, one soldier thought that he had heard the command, "Fire." He shot into the crowd, and the crowd moved toward them. The other soldiers panicked and fired more shots. Within moments, 5 people lay dead or dying, and 6 more were wounded.
All at once, having limited space to explore, having to pay extra for paper products, and housing soldiers is suddenly irrelevant. The group of people enforcing these rules just crossed the line. They have now killed and wounded these colonists that they were supposed to be protecting.
This tragic event became known as the Boston Massacre. A silversmith named Paul Revere made an engraving, or image etched into metal, of the massacre. The engraving shows British soldiers firing at a peaceful crowd, even though that was not actually what happened.
Powerful words right there. Why do you suppose Paul Revere chose to display the Boston Massacre in this way? I want you to think about that and have something prepared for when we review on Thursday during our Zoom conferences. Getting back to the main event though, take a look at Paul Revere's engraving here in this modern day photo. Do you see any similarities between the two? Allow me to outline things for you. Notice the background of Paul Revere's engraving. Look at the shape of it. Now look at the outline of this building in the present day photo. Yep, it's an exact match. This is the very building where the Boston Massacre took place. In fact, this historical event is so monumental to our nation's history that there is a seal engraved in the streets to pinpoint the exact location of the Boston Massacre. I went to Boston a few summers ago and just had to visit this site again. Now, I've been to this city and I've been to this spot plenty of times before. But the last time I went there, I knew I was going to get an opportunity to teach you guys about this. And so I just stood at that spot and it was like I went back in time. To think that 250 years earlier, something like that happened in this exact spot. Needless to say, chills. I encourage you, when you have the ability to do so, go visit these places that our United States were founded on. It's one thing to learn about these events from a textbook or a video, but to actually be there in person, to know here's what happened right here where I'm standing, takes your understanding of it to a whole new level. Obviously, this was a massive event in our history. Let's sum it up real quick before moving on. After constantly fighting with each other, the violence between the colonists and the soldiers jumped up to another level after the British soldiers took fire upon a crowd of people with their muskets. This mass chaos resulted in 5 colonists dead, 6 injured, and an entire city ready to explode with anger. So what happened next? Well, let's see.
Colonists shared news in letters or correspondence. Colonial governments had begun to set up informal committees of correspondence in the 1760s, and members of these groups let one another know what was going on in their regions.
If Twitter was around back then, it's a guarantee that the Boston Massacre would be the #1 trending topic for weeks on end. It wasn't, obviously, but that didn't stop the colonists from sharing the news from town to town. Remember that back then, news traveled a lot slower, and so it took a while for the news to spread to all the other colonies. And with something that important, the colonists really wanted to make sure it got spread to the appropriate places. And to do that, they needed some organization. So for that, they turned to a man that you might have heard of before.
Samuel Adams was a leader of the protests against the British, and he made sure that the news of the massacre spread throughout the colonies. In 1772, Adams helped form a permanent committee of correspondence in Massachusetts. This group wanted to unite the colonists to protest against British actions.
United they were. And in about 4 years from then, united they would stay. For the first time, all the colonists had something to talk about that they were all personally invested in. No matter where you were in the colonies, you could talk about the Boston Massacre. And the odds were pretty good that you could pick any random colonists off the street and they would agree with you that Great Britain had to go. Whew, that was a lot. Let's pause for a second and fill out our notes for our modern day example and how it compares to the real historical events. So after being forced to pay extra for their snacks, the students and the yard duties start arguing with each other. Now in the case of the Boston Massacre, this translates to the crowds taunt the British soldiers and throw snowballs at them. After arguing back and forth for a little bit, the principal comes over and punishes your class for arguing with the yard duties. In the case of the Boston Massacre, this translates to British soldiers firing into the crowd and killing and injuring 5 people. Guys, that's going to do it for today's daily dose of history. Head back over to the Google Classroom and answer today's question of the day, and be sure to come back here tomorrow because tomorrow's video has all of the tea. Literally, like all of it. You don't want to miss it. So with that said, I'll see you right here tomorrow.